So the reading is from 2 Chronicles 20, verses 1 to 13, and then 18 to 21. After this, the Moabites and Ammonites, with some of the Mennonites, came to wage war against Jehoshaphat. Some people came and told Jehoshaphat, "A vast army is coming against you from Edom, from the other side of the Dead Sea. It is already in Hazezon Tamar, that is En-Gedi." Alarmed, Jehoshaphat resolved to inquire of the Lord, and he proclaimed a fast for all Judah. The people of Judah came together to seek help from the Lord. Indeed, they came from every town in Judah to seek him. Then Jehoshaphat stood up in the assembly of Judah and Jerusalem at the temple of the Lord in front of the new courtyard and said, "Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? They have lived in it and have built in it a sanctuary for your name, saying, 'If calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name, and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us.' But now here are men from Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt. So they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." All the men of Judah, with their wives and children and little ones, stood there before the Lord. Jehoshaphat bowed down with his face to the ground, and all the people of Judah and Jerusalem fell down in worship before the Lord. Then some Levites came from the Kohathites, and the Korahites stood up and praised the Lord, the God of Israel, with a very loud voice. Early in the morning, they left for the desert of Tekoa. As they set out, Jehoshaphat stood and said, "Listen to me, Judah, the people of Jerusalem. Have faith in the Lord your God, and you will be upheld. Have faith in his prophets, and you will be successful." After consulting the people, Jehoshaphat appointed men to sing to the Lord and praise him for the splendor of his holiness, as they went out at the head of the army, saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for his love endures forever." This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Alex. I like to make my husband work in the morning with a nice long Bible verse, you know. You don't get it easy just because I'm preaching. And there's some big names in that as well, weren't there? Yeah. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all having a good weekend. I've got a question for you. Has anybody been doing a lot of exercise this weekend? Anyone been for like a run? Yeah, good one, Tim. Anyone been for a run? Yeah, good. Does anyone do park run? Something I was wondering. No, nobody here does park run. Oh, I was wondering, I think often something about like being a church person and park run is probably the Venn diagram. It's quite a popular, quite a lot of church people like to do it. And so if you don't know, park run, it's sort of like it's all over the world, I think, kind of a 5K run that's put on in local parks and green spaces. It's not something I myself particularly love. I have a friend who was always trying to get me to go, always trying to invite me along, and I'd always say, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, thanks, and no thanks. And then one time, she and I were both on holiday together on the Isle of Wight, and I had no excuse because we were both there together, and I had the car, and I had to take her, so I had to do parkrun. And it was fine. If you're ever forced to go, it's fine. You can get through it. It's not too long. But what I observed as we then drove home is actually parkrun is really similar to church. I realised there's quite a few things they have in common. To begin with, they are very welcoming of new people. I hope if you have turned up new today or before, you felt welcomed. You know, we've got people welcoming on the door. That's what they have at parkrun. They're very, very smiley for 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. Very glad that you are there. They do a lot of call and response at parkrun. They have this whole thing where they say, "It's not a race," and then all the people go, "It's a run." And if you're new, you're like, what? But that is a little bit like what we do at church. We do a lot of, "The peace of the Lord is with you, and also with you." And when it's communion, I think there's a whole, we've got our liturgy, we're back and forth. They start early at the weekend. There's no denying, we're here at 10. They start at 9, and that's the reason I never wanted to go. My Saturdays are precious to me, and I don't want to get up for 9 o'clock. So yeah, they like an early start as well. And so I was sitting in the car after the parkrun, and I was relaying this all to my friend who doesn't go to church, and I was saying, it's really similar. There's a lot of overlap. And I'm kind of saying to her, you should go to church. If you like parkrun, you should go to church. But she's like, but they don't do any singing. I was like, that's true. That is true. There is no singing at parkrun. And that got me thinking, because singing is a pretty integral part of our Sundays. I've been going to church for many years, and I'm willing to bet that every church service that I have been to, there has been some sort of designated time for worship. It's sort of always there. I've been to services where actually we got so caught up in the worship that we didn't even do a preach. It just kept going and going. And maybe that was because the preacher didn't really want to do a preach, but I don't know. But, that's always there. And sometimes the notices get forgotten. Sometimes the prayers get cut down. But the worship is always there. And it can take many different shapes and forms. Alex and I, we once went to a church, like an evening service, and they didn't have many people on the worship rota. So they just played YouTube videos. And everyone still sang along. It was still worship. Sometimes we'll have like designated particular services. Like we used to do worship at 7, and now we have our praise and prayer evenings where we're singing for a longer period of time. Or maybe you'll go to something like big church day out or the weekend. And you're there and you're dedicating many days. There's David's tent. That's another one where people go and they'll literally do days and days and days of worship. So it's sort of written to the fabric of our church life that we will always worship. We'll just sort of do it. But maybe you're someone for whom all this was new. Maybe you started coming to church a little bit later in life and you thought, why? This is weird. We don't do it in many other parts of our lives. Like, say, at parkrun, they're not singing. They're not singing in many other places at the weekend. So that's what I want to unpack today. Why do we do this? Why is it important for us to worship? When we hear the word worship, I wonder how many of us sort of automatically think of singing. We're kind of used to having singers like we had today, doing a fabulous job in our worship team. Thank you, guys. And we sort of see worship songs as a genre on music. If you look at things like Spotify, it's sort of worship equals songs. So we kind of get used to this assumption that worship equals singing. And it's true to some extent. Singing to God is a great form of worship, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. But it's so much more than just singing. Because if worship was just singing, some of us would be much better worshippers than others. These guys would be very good. I, on the other hand, would not be very good. I would not be a good worshipper because I'm not a very good singer. And, any time that I'm preaching and like Neil gives me this little microphone, a panic goes through me that somehow it will like get turned on during the song. And my slightly raspy voice with no real range will blare out. I don't know if anyone else has a similar fear. It could be worse, though. My dad, he wasn't even going to be here. He's here, and I've got to embarrass him now. When he was a mere 5 years old, he was put in the non-singers category at school, and they just had to mime the singing, because apparently, I quote, they were told not to spoil the sound. Oh, I know. I put that in as a joke, but the more I read it, the sadder it makes me feel. I mean, if you work with 5-year-olds, please never tell a 5-year-old that they can't sing. That's a horrible, yeah. So, yeah, it could be worse. But so fortunately for people like me, my dad, and others who relate to this, your ability at singing does not determine how good a worshipper you are, because worship is about more than that. It's about giving glory and honor and praise to God. We can and we should worship God through singing, but we give glory and honor to God by living a life that is dependent on his grace and his honor and being obedient to his word. As Jesus put it in John 4, verse 23, "A time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for they are the kinds of worshippers that the Father seeks." So there is hope for all of us after all. Let's dive into the reading that we heard from Alex earlier. It was in 2 Chronicles, which is in the Old Testament. And to put this period into context, it's a time when God's people had sort of a succession of kings. And you had your initial famous ones that you might have heard of. You had David, and you had Solomon, and Saul before David, actually Saul, David, Solomon. And then after them, there was sort of a kind of a quick transition between some other kings that we don't hear about half as often. And one of those kings, as we heard today, was a guy called Jehoshaphat. Now, as biblical names go, this one has not stood the test of time. I mean, like, hands up if you know a David, for example. We all know at least 2 Davids, or 3, yeah. So, yeah, everyone know a David? Yeah. A Daniel? Yeah. You know Daniel? Yeah. Sam, or a Samuel, or a Sammy? Yeah, we all know. Hands up if you know a Jehoshaphat. Yeah, I wanted to check, because I thought, well, maybe I'm just ignorant. Maybe there are a lot of them out there, but no, there are none. Maybe if you know anyone expecting a little boy, it's a name you could consider. But for some reason, it really hasn't stood the test of time very well. So a little bit of background on Jehoshaphat. His dad was a king. His dad was King Asa, so he took over the throne from him. And we know that he was doing quite well as king, because chapter 18 in 2 Chronicles, it starts by telling us that he had great wealth and he had great honor. And then he sort of made some allies. He was quite well connected because he married into this sort of big dynasty in a different area. And so therefore, they're all kind of politically connected. And that meant that he was related to King Ahab, who was king of a neighboring area. Now, what sets Jehoshaphat apart from the other leaders at the time is that he wasn't just driven by wealth and status. Now, he may have been a bit driven by wealth and status, but he had other things on his mind as well. And we can see this because he's connected through marriage to Ahab, and Ahab asks him for military aid in a battle he's got coming up. And Jehoshaphat agrees to help, but he first of all requests that God be consulted before they go into battle. And that's our first indication that Jehoshaphat is a man who really puts God first. Now, it's a bit of a roller coaster for Jehoshaphat. There is a bit of a lapse in judgment, and he decides to help Ahab out in a battle. And there's a prophecy warning them, saying, you really shouldn't do this, it's not a good idea. But he goes anyway, and that battle results in Ahab's death. And I think what happens is a bit of a wake-up call for Jehoshaphat. He comes back from the battle, he survives, but he realizes he's got to do better by God. And he then spends quite a period of time kind of going around converting fallen people and testifying and exclaiming about how they need to convert their lives to God and teaching him to follow God's law. And then we get to chapter 20, where we have this kind of combined forces of different tribes, and they have agreed to wage war on Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah. So the story of 2 Chronicles chapter 20 is an important one because it shows us some real key features of why we should worship. And the reason that I chose it today is because I think we can learn a lot from Jehoshaphat and his people as to why we should worship God. So I've got 4 reasons. There's many more, but I've focused on 4 today. And my first reason is to glorify God. So in verses 6 to 13, we have this powerful speech from Jehoshaphat where he stands up in the temple and he prays to God about the situation that they are in as people threatened by attack. And he starts that prayer by declaring how powerful God is. Before anything else, before asking for help or admitting fear, he starts his prayer to God by acknowledging who he is speaking to. In verse 6, he says to God, "Are you not God in heaven, and do you not rule over all the kingdoms of the nations?" Now, this is significant because the neighbouring tribes at this time, they believed in localised gods. They so like the Moabites, for example, they had a god for their land, and then the Philistines, they had a god, and the Ammonites, they had a god of their land, and so on. But in his prayer, Jehoshaphat is acknowledging that God is not just the God of Judah, he is in fact the God of all kingdoms, of all the nations, of all of earth and of heaven above. Now, I don't know about you, this might just be me, but if I don't stop to really worship God properly, I can be a little bit keen to view him, a bit like a Father Christmas sort of figure. Like maybe I'm sort of presenting this list of things that I could do with his help with. I'm sort of a bit like, "Hi God, it'd be really great if I could have this," or, could I get that promotion at work, or a friend really needs some healing, and life's a bit stressful, could you ease this up? And now I should caveat by saying that, God loves it when we come and speak to him. So, if this is new to you, there's nothing wrong with that. Communication with God is so important. So this is certainly better than nothing. It's good to talk to God. But how often do we really start our time with God by simply acknowledging his power before we've asked for anything? There's nothing wrong with coming to God and asking for our needs and desires. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But God is not our servant that we're presenting some sort of shopping list to. He is so much more powerful than that. And this is where sung worship can be really powerful, because through our songs we can praise God for who he is. In the New Testament, in Colossians, it tells us to sing our hearts out to God. Let every detail of your lives, words and actions be done in the name of Master Jesus, thanking God the Father every step of the way. Or if we look at the book of Psalms, for example, it is full of these songs from people acknowledging God's power. I could have picked out so many of them today. One of them that stood out to me is Psalm 66. In verses 3 and 4, it says, "Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. So great is your power that your enemies cringe before you. All the earth bows down to you. They sing praises to you. They sing praises of your name." So why is it important to worship God? First reason is to acknowledge his power, whether that be through praying or singing or any other form of creative worship. The next reason, it gives us a time to be vulnerable with God. So if we look back at our story in 2 Chronicles, we know that Jehoshaphat was scared. He recently went into battle, a battle that had not ended well, and he'd seen his in-law, King Ahab, get slaughtered on the battlefield. And that would have been playing in his mind, and now he's in a situation where his own people are about to be attacked, and it means yet another battle. But, he's a leader, he's a king. It was probably really tempting for him. He knew what to do. He probably thought, you know what, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to be really brave, I'm going to give sort of a rousing speech to his crowd of people, and I'm going to sort of declare that, we mustn't give up and we will win. But no, that's not what he does. That's not Jehoshaphat's way. In verse 12, it tells us, he says to God, "For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do." Quite literally the opposite of a rousing speech. And again, he doesn't come to God with specific demands here, just an open and honest declaration of his fear. As humans, we love to try and quickly solve a problem when we are faced with one. If you've ever watched any of those sort of like survival reality TV shows, you'll know that like the contestants that like keep their composure and like can work out a plan in a crisis and think of next steps, they're the ones that are seen as like really resilient rather than the ones that are just like panicking and crumbling. And the British in particular, we're like notorious for this. We've got like a whole mentality built on like stiff upper lip and like keep calm and carry on and staying steady in a crisis and stuff. And there is a time and a place for that. I'm not completely like knocking it. You can't find a parking space or the Wi-Fi goes down. I'm not saying we should like crumble at every little thing. But when we're faced with the really big challenges in life, the stuff that is really worrying and scary, the stuff that wakes you up in the middle of the night, how do we present that to God? Do we come before him with our plan of attack and say, look, God, if I could just have X or Y, it would all be fine. That's all I need. Then the struggle will be over. Or do we just simply allow ourselves to be truly vulnerable and admit that we are scared or anxious or confused, however we may be feeling, and just hand it to God? Because that is what Jehoshaphat is demonstrating to hundreds of his people right now. He's not come up with a list of battle tactics that he wants God to carry out or any sort of game plan. Instead, the king stands before all his people and openly confesses that he doesn't have the answer. And what's so powerful is because he is vulnerable and honest about his own weaknesses, he is then able to proclaim to his people that the only answer that they have is to trust in God, that his power would protect Judah when nothing else and nobody else could. There's a writer called Martin J. Spellman, and he puts it like this: the final phrase, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are upon you," is one of the most touching expressions of truth in God to be found. Touching expressions of trust in God to be found anywhere in the Bible. Now, there are some other examples. One of them that came to mind for me was in Acts 1, when Paul and Silas, they were put in jail, and they spent the whole night in jail. They weren't trying to, hatch a plan of how to escape. They weren't trying to be the tough new guys in prison. No, they just were truly vulnerable and they sung out to God. So we've seen how worshipping God is important because it allows us time and space to acknowledge his power, and it allows us space to be vulnerable with him. The third reason that I believe worship is important is because we can humble ourselves through worship. So if we look at the story in 2 Chronicles, we can see how Jehoshaphat doesn't just stop by admitting he was scared. He goes even further than that. The Spirit of God falls upon a guy called Jahaziel. This might have been in the bit that we cut out, but if you go back and read it all, what happens is the Spirit of God falls upon a guy called Jahaziel, and he was able to prophesy God's promise that he would protect the people. And he relayed some practical battle tactics that they needed, and he also gave all the people God's reassurance. And because of that message that falls on Jahaziel, Jehoshaphat is so grateful to God that he bows down with his face to the ground. He's literally bowing down in front of all these people. Now, let's not forget, this is a king in front of thousands of his people, not just, a pastor in the church. This is a king. And, this is kind of like if we were to see Rishi Sunak or Joe Biden or member of the royal family or whoever you can think of, someone with such high status just lying down in front of thousands of the people. It's not something we're really used to seeing adults do. It's not something we probably would feel very comfortable ourselves doing, just sort of, I'm going to lie in front of everybody. It's something that it's quite a powerless position to be in. For Jehoshaphat, everyone's now taller than him. He's kind of given up any display of royal status at this point. He's no longer bothered about how his people see him. And we see similar displays of God's people humbling themselves through physical worship throughout the Bible. In 2 Samuel, we hear about King David. He danced before the Lord with all of his might, and he asked God, this was after the Ark of the Covenant had been returned, so he was dancing in praise, and it was pretty undignified behaviour, especially for an Old Testament king. And Saul's daughter, she looked down at him and she saw David dancing and leaping around, and the Bible says that she despised him. But David, he wasn't afraid of her judgment, and he said to her, I was dancing before the Lord who chose me and appointed me, ruler of Lord's people of Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord, and I will humble myself even more and humiliate myself. And so if we think back to Jehoshaphat, there's this added level of humility here. He's not just dancing, he's lying down. It's kind of like an act of submission or respect, a bit like, someone bowing before a king or a servant, bowing before their master. And that is what Jehoshaphat is showing here. So his display of humility is an example to his people watching. And the Bible tells us they followed suit and they fell down in worship before the Lord as well. But humbling ourselves is not just about lying down. There are other physical ways that we can do this too. Earlier in the chapter, Jehoshaphat called the nation to express their humility and their dependence on God through a public fast. Jesus talks about the power of fasting in Mark in chapter 9. He explains that prayer and fasting together were a source of great, significant spiritual power. It's not that the prayer and fasting make us more worthy or more blessed to do God's work. It's that the prayer and fasting draws us closer to the heart of God, and they put us more in line with his power. So fasting is a powerful expression of total dependence on him, and another form of worship, you could say. It's Lent at the moment, and I know a lot of people like to give things up. That's sort of like a form of fasting, maybe something that you've done a bit or would consider doing. So now it's our fourth and final reason why we should worship. It unites us. If we look back at the start of chapter 20, the Bible tells us how the people of Judah had all come together to seek help from the Lord. It says that they came from every town in Judah. So it's a group of people from all different walks of life coming together with one thing in common: they are people of God. And then in verse 13, we heard about how it wasn't just the men of Judah. We had the men of Judah, their wives, their children, and it says the little ones, so the babies. So it's spanning multiple generations too. And I think the mention of children is really significant here, because throughout the Bible, we don't often get the children mentioned like specifically like that. It's kind of like we can assume that they were there, but unless they're sort of vital to the story, they don't really get acknowledged in that way. So I think we've got to consider the unity going on here. It's not just people from various towns, it's multiple generations, all differences coming together to acknowledge God. And then the Bible tells us how they stood before the Lord. They're all doing the same thing, the same act of attention and respect. It's not, our picnics by the lake, which we hear about in the New Testament. This is sort of like an assembly, all standing at the same time. And for the people of Judah, this is a time where they do need to stand as one, because they're about to go into battle. There's no subsection of the group that is more engaged than the rest. It's not like we've got sort of our generals and our, military terminology, sergeants, privates, whatever it may be. They're all one group. They might not have been especially united before, but after arriving at the temple, they certainly were afterwards. And it's sort of the same for us today when we come to church. We all come from different backgrounds. We all lead different lives during the week. We've got different jobs. We've got different ways of lives. But we come together on a Saturday, on a Sunday. So I was going to say our Mondays to Saturdays have been very different. We come together on a Sunday to experience. We come together to unite and worship God. I listened to a talk by the musician Nick Drake, who is actually the husband of the lady who wrote the song that we just sang, so it all comes together. He was giving a preach on, even though he's a worship leader, he was giving a preach on worship, and he was in a church over in America, so he's British, but he was invited to a church in Portland. And he recognised that while he was preaching, so Portland's on the west coast of America. He has some friends who were on the east coast, I think in New York, so they were a few hours ahead, and they had therefore already been at church a few hours before that. And Nick's wife and family, they were still at home in the UK, so a few hours before that, they'd been at church in London. And then he acknowledged how, there's all the churches in Asia, they'd been at church a few hours before that, and then all the ones in Australia and New Zealand a few hours before that. And so therefore, all over the world, people from completely different countries and cultures would have been united, that throughout that Sunday, they have all been worshipping God. Or another example that's maybe a little bit closer to home, if you think back to the COVID pandemic, nearly 4 years exactly, I don't know if that seems like time has flown by or just a long time ago. But back then there was this video that circulated online of the song The Blessing. I don't know if you saw it. I'm sure a lot of you have. If you haven't, I recommend checking it out. It's brilliant. What happens is you have, because everyone couldn't be together, you had these little clips of various singers from different churches across the country, and it would sort of say at the bottom the churches that they were at. And so you could work out, they sort of stretched all the way from Brighton to Aberdeen, and they kind of represented all the different types of churches you can think of, all the different denominations. I watched it back to count, and there was Pentecostal, Salvation Army, Methodist, C of E, Catholic, Orthodox, and a whole lot more as well. There were little village parish churches, there were mega churches, there were traditional, there were kind of new churches. We had England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They were all represented. There were all ages, races, and musical backgrounds. And at the time, if you watched the video during the pandemic, there was a whole lot of emotion tied up in that, because it was sort of, we couldn't be together in church. So, and we were waiting for this pandemic to end, and it felt very emotional. But when I rewatch it now, in 2024, what stands out the most to me is actually, this is such a range of God's people coming together to worship him. And we know that different denominations of the church don't always agree on everything. I don't have to tell you that. But actually, even though there can be different disagreements about all sorts of things, what that video shows so powerfully is that this range of people can come together to agree on lifting God high up in worship. And it's the same at a local level. We're all different people. And when we come to church, we don't always agree on everything, but we stand together and we worship as one. We are laying aside all differences to lift up God together as one united church. Now, chapter 20, we didn't finish it in a reading. Alex had done enough reading. I didn't make him go any further. The story carries on, and I encourage you to read it later because it is very good. You've got to find out what happens, basically, in this battle. I'm afraid, going to have to give you a little bit of a spoiler. Spoiler alert. God sends an ambush against the attacking Ammonites and Moabites, and Jehoshaphat and his people are free. So it's a happy ending. But another reason I didn't go any further with the reading, not just to protect Alex, is because I don't think today what we're looking at in this chapter, it's not actually about the outcome of that battle. It's not about that end result. It's about how a fearful king collected his people in worship, not after the battle was won, not after they were celebrating, but before they knew what the outcome was. I think that's really important for us about worshiping God, not when we've got what we wanted, but when we're in the midst of the unknown, in the scary and uncertain times. So, going to draw to a close there, and I hope the importance of worship has really resonated. I think it's amazing to read a story like one of Jehoshaphat, which we don't hear so often, and realise that what happened thousands of years ago is what we need to replicate today. So we can use our worship time to honour and glorify God, to be vulnerable with him, to humble ourselves, and to be united with our fellow believers. So I'm just going to end in a prayer. Dear God, thank you so much for who you are, that you are a God not just of Bracknell and Warfield, not just of England, but a God of the whole world and the heavens above. I thank you that you want to hear our requests and you want to listen to our worries and fears and our celebrations too. I pray that as we go forward with our weeks and months, that we will make time to carve out time to worship you, to come forth in prayer, or in praise, in sung worship, in any other creative form that we may have. And you may bless our weeks and months and encourage us and inspire us to do this more. Amen.